Hey folks, what's happening? We're going to keep moving into section 7 here, looking at ideas of social control theory. When we go here, we might as well start at the beginning, and the beginning takes us back to about the 18th century and we look at the work of Cesar Bessaria. Bessaria believed that individuals are rational hedonistic actors, and they are acting upon their free will. They're trying to maximize their pleasure, minimize their pain. Bessaria was seeking to reform the system of punishment. He wanted to get things in line with this new idea of rational action and pleasure and pain seekers. He believed that people are attracted to norm violation and motivated to deviate. In Bessaria's eyes, all people are capable of feeling motivated to deviate. And he was really trying to understand why people deviated from rules, not why don't they follow the rules. Then we fast forward to 1956, and we start to see social control theory regain its significance in the social sciences, especially in the use of criminology. Ivan Nye is an important social theorist. He's looking at internal social control versus external social control. Internal social control, of course, is the internal discussion to not commit crimes. For Nye, rules and norms instilled in the child directly and indirectly impact their ability to control their behavior. These may be ineffective if rules and norms are not agreed upon by the majority. Children may come to disagree with the rules and norms as they move through the socialization process. External social control, or the external discussion not to commit the crime, is the dichotomous variable that Nye is presenting for us. And here we see rules and norms set by society, indirectly or directly. Direct controls are forms of punishment, disapproval, ridicule, or banishment, and indirect controls are things like parents' use of disapproval. For Nye, deviant behavior results from insufficient social controls, internal and external, and alternative means to need satisfaction are needed so that individuals do not have to engage in deviant behavior. So maybe more jobs being available in low-income areas that would then prevent those kids from engaging in the drug trade. When applying Nye's social control theory, the book looks at Jamila and Rashad, who are brother and sister that go through some real trying circumstances, and they have different social outcomes, partly because of the different life chances presented to them. When they talk about Jamila, they say that she had good internal controls that were shaped by her grandparents. However, her external controls were weakened upon their death, which then resulted in skipping school and dropping out of school. Rashad, on the other hand, grew up with little controls set in place. Both his internal and external controls were weak due to the lack of socialization as a result of his grandparents' death. So Rashad really didn't get any of getting any meaningful socialization from his grandparents because he was too young. And that lack of an internal control was very problematic for Rashad as he grew into adolescence and then into young adult and adulthood. That brings us to Travis Hershey's social control theory. For Hershey, deviance is not a response to learned behavior, stimulus, or strains. Deviance is a given, and it is the absence of deviance that needs to be explained. So for Hershey, everybody's going to engage in deviant behavior. That's the norm. So when you don't encounter deviant behavior, that's when you have to start questioning what's going on. This theory does not question why people are being deviant, but why are people not being deviant, as I mentioned before. It's also looking at reasons we don't engage in deviance or crime is primarily due to the social bonds to conformity. For Hershey, there were 4 components to social bonds: attachment, commitment, involvement, and belief. Attachment is that emotional bond. Essentially, we care about conformity, and especially in reference to others' opinions. Maybe you're thinking about not engaging in deviant behavior because you think your mom might not like that. Commitment is a rational bond, a commitment to conventional society. So maybe you have a good job and you don't want to lose that job. It's a significant commitment to the status quo, and engaging in deviant behavior will create some problems for you in that realm. Involvement in conformist activities leaves less time for deviance. Once again, if you fill your time up with non-deviant behavior, well, then you're just going to have less time to engage in deviant behavior. And then, of course, belief, or an awareness or understanding and agreement with the rules and norms which ultimately influence deviance conformity. So if you agree with the social norms, if you agree with the way society has chosen to structure itself and its system of rewards and punishments, then you're less likely to engage in deviant behavior. A good example, going back to the differences between Jamila and Rashad, for using Hershey's social control theory to explain their behavior, we could say that Rashad's bonds to society were weak, resulting in his deviant behavior, whereas Jamila had a stronger set of bonds. Rashad did not have a strong sense of attachment to family after his grandparents' death, whereas Jamila was given an opportunity to create new attachments when she was adopted, or at least brought into the home of some family friends. And of course, Rashad had a weak belief or understanding of the norms of society and followed the norms of the groups he was most involved with, which was the criminal element in the poor neighborhood he remained in after his grandparents died. Another thing to think about is techniques of neutralization. When we think about neutralization, we think of Sykes and Matza. They were attempting to explain why individuals engage in deviance even though they understand it's wrong. And essentially the rationalizations that they use to explain away their deviant behavior. This rationalization is referred to as neutralization. Essentially norms and rules, if you're accepting this idea, you have to accept that norms and rules are flexible, and under certain circumstances there are exemptions. A good example of this is that killing is wrong except under certain circumstances. If you find yourself in a war, well, you might engage in killing, and it's not constructed as wrong. Or if, for example, you killed somebody in self-defense, that might not be constructed as a negative either, or a deviation from the social norm. So for Sykes and Matza, The techniques of neutralization include the denial of responsibility, essentially saying, well, I'm not responsible for those folks' behaviors. A denial of injury, well, I didn't hurt anybody, so what's the big deal? The denial of the victim, well, I don't even know if there's an existing victim or not. And you know what? They probably deserved what they got in the first place. They brought it on themselves. The condemnation of the condemners, well, you know, those in glass houses shouldn't throw the first stone. Don't point your finger at me, because we know that you're deviant as well. And the appeal to higher loyalties, or the larger society loses out to the wishes of a smaller society. My commitments are to my smaller group, and I chose to break the social norms because I felt that my smaller group deserved more consideration from me than the larger group. Coming back to the techniques of neutralization and the example of Rashad and Jamila, we can use the techniques to explain why Rashad became a drug dealer. Think about the denial of responsibility. Well, it's not really his fault. He was propelled into drug dealing at a young age. He had to bag marijuana as punishment when he was young, for God's sake. And look at the neighborhood he lived in. Or victimless deviance. He's not really harming anyone. Those that buy the drugs, they're choosing to do so. They're engaging in the expression of their own free will. Or let's appeal to the higher loyalties. Rashad was given all of his guidance by drug dealers. They were his only close connections. They're the ones that really looked out for him. And Rashad really made the right and rational decision to stick with those people that cared about him. That brings us to Hagen, Gillis, and Simpson, essentially their power control theory. This is bringing us more into the contemporary world of social theory. We're leapfrogging out of the late 1950s and 60s into the late 1980s. And class and control theories of deviance are used to explain the effects of familial control on gender differences in crime. These theorists discuss how the workforce affects patriarchal attitudes within the household, and therefore different levels of control are placed on boys and girls in these households, which in turn create differences in likelihood to take risk. So in a household where there's a shared amount of power, we're more likely to see similar amounts of deviant behavior than in households that are strictly patriarchal. So in households that share the power, we're more likely to see young girls engaging in deviant behavior as we are young boys. But in patriarchal households, we're much more likely to see young boys engaging in deviant behavior than we are young girls. Some assumptions of the power control theory that we have to take in consideration here. Mothers constitute the primary agent of socialization in the family. Once again, this idea of balanced households where both the mother and father work outside the home. The mothers will be less likely to differentially exert control upon their daughters, which then allows them to engage in more deviant behavior. And as I was saying earlier, more patriarchal households will place greater levels of control on the daughters than on the sons, and therefore we'll see sons engaging in more deviant behavior than the daughters.